Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Goldster Conversation. We're here today for PPG, Purpose, Passion, Grit, with Nancy Churnin. Now, Nancy is somebody I discovered through the Dickens Museum and this fabulous book written for children called Dear Mr. Dickens, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But Nancy, welcome all the way from Texas.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. It's so great to be with you. Thank you.
I cannot believe how good you look for what is a ridiculously early hour of the morning for you. So I do very much appreciate you getting up so early in the morning to come on to Goldster. Tell us, who was Eliza Davis and how did you first hear her story?
Eliza Davis was a Jewish woman who lived around the time of Charles Dickens. And how did I discover her is a very interesting story. I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory on this. My mother is a retired teacher, and our house was always filled with books. And one of my favorite authors always was Charles Dickens, because, of course, Charles Dickens, one of the greatest writers of all time. And my mother would say to me, "How can you read Charles Dickens?" Because she was very focused on Fagin being an ugly Jewish stereotype in Oliver Twist. And I just knew I knew that Charles Dickens, there was so much more to him than that, and that his heart had to be an incredibly big heart to write the incredible books that he did. And I knew there was more to him. And I was always reading stories. And back when I became a children's book author, and I was researching people, I would always be looking up articles about Charles Dickens. And one day I found an article while doing research in the computer, like 2 lines, and it said something about, because of this Jewish woman, Eliza Davis, Charles Dickens created the kindly Mr. Rhea, a positive Jewish character in our mutual friend. And I went, what? What happened? Where's this correspondence? And so I talked to my friendly librarian. I love librarians. Shout out to librarians. They are magicians.
I know we've got some here, so that'll be appreciated.
Yay. How can I find Eliza Davis? How can I find this correspondence? And next thing I knew, this wonderful librarian said, well, there's an out-of-print book with all their letters, all their correspondence. Well, they actually said there was one in London, but you had to fly to London. I live in Texas. You'd have to fly to London, make an appointment. You can't take pictures of it. I mean, it was all like under wrap and key. I think it was at the University of Southampton, and which I later went back to, and they were a great help to me. But she said there are 2 out-of-print copies in the US, and one of them is in Denton, Texas, 40 minutes from your house.
Wow, that's amazing. That was meant to be.
It was so meant to be. And I called the University of North Texas, and they said, well, if you're interested in this, you must talk to Professor Don Van, who was retired professor, but the head of the Dickens Society in Denton. And he donated this book on one of his many trips with his wife to London, because he's so devoted to all things Dickens. And I called him up, and we became great friends. He became a mentor. You know what? I wrote this book over a period of about almost 10 years, because I had to figure out, people said to me, how can you make a book of letters interesting? How can you make a correspondence interesting? No one's heard of Eliza Davis. And they even said the kids won't know who Charles Dickens is. They only learn about him when they're older. And I was just so determined. And with Professor Van's mentorship, and he introduced me to Dickens scholar, the late Professor David Perossian, who was
I loved David Perossian. Wonderful.
He was so wonderful, and he was such a help to me in critical stages. And also Professor Murray Baumgarten, who at the University of Santa Cruz, who originated the Dickens Project, which I got to attend with the book. So I just had wonderful support, and I also thank the Dickens Society. But yes, it was a lot of research, but the trick was also writing in a way that would be engaging for children.
And this is so much more than just a book. I mean, the real reason I wanted you to come on for PPG today is you've created a massive project around this one book in anti-Semitic education, haven't you? So tell us exactly how Eliza met Charles Dickens, and what was the correspondence that inspired you to do this book?
Well, she met him in a very interesting way that I get into in the back matter within the main book. And that is that Charles Dickens wanted to sell his house. I believe it was Tavistock House, so that he could buy the Gad's Hill house. And Eliza Davis and her husband were looking for this house in London, and they approached him about that. And I have to tell you, Lucinda, there is a record in my research where Charles Dickens wrote to one of his friends and went, "Oh, these Jewish people want to buy my house. This is going to be..."
Oh no, I can only apologize on behalf of the family.
No, but again, this is where, this is the greatness of Charles Dickens. So he thinks it's going to be awful because you know what? He's immersed in the stereotypes of his time.
And this was the time, wasn't it? It was a very xenophobic culture.
Yes, and it was a segregated time. And you know what? When you interact with people, and he never really interacted with Jewish people,
Yeah.
he, believes all these assumptions and these stereotypes. And then the negotiations went so well, he wrote back, and almost with an embarrassed tone in his letter to the same friend, he said, that was one of the best interactions I have ever had. They were so fair. They were so sweet. They were so kind. I mean, they had made a tremendously positive impression on him. And after this happened, and it was all such a good exchange, and he had such good feelings about them, the Jewish community had long wanted to reach out to Charles Dickens because he was admired by everyone, including the Jewish community, even though the Jewish characters in his books were not very positive, but they could see, what a wonderful force he was for good, standing up for children, for the poor. And they actually had written a letter to him in the Jewish Chronicle in London, which he totally ignored. And her first letter to him borrowed from a lot of the language in that Jewish Chronicle article. But she also asked him, because she, like Charles Dickens, cared about charity. And she actually asked him for a donation for a fund started by the Montefiore family. Mm-hmm. And, he could see she was a generous, a kind, a charitable person. And matter of fact, probably very similar to him.
Yeah.
And he connected, but even at first, he was a little put off by her first letter, because it was like, how can you accuse me of not being fair? I mean, I'm the most fair person. I mean, really, he did so much good and so much charitable work.
He didn't take criticism well.
No. You know what? And also, I have to say, here he is, the most famous person in London, like right up there with the Queen. And who is she? Who's ever heard of Eliza Davis? So, but here's the thing about Eliza Davis: she persisted, right?
Yes.
And here's the thing about the brilliant thing about her second letter. I really feel she thought about how to connect with him. Mm-hmm. And that's why I feel like she appealed to his sense of the past, when the fact that he loved books like Ivanhoe when he was a boy, and think about the positive Jewish characters there. Yeah. The present, where yes, there were Jewish criminals that he wrote about very accurately. Yes, but there were also good Jewish people that he was not writing about. Yeah. And then he appealed to his sense of the future. So, the ghosts of the past, the present, and the future. And I think that she spoke his language. And I think that's also a lesson for all of us. Sometimes when we can't connect, sometimes what we really need to do is make that extra leap and speak in another person's language. Yes, they may be also both be speaking English, but that doesn't mean that in the first letter, she was really connecting with the way he thought and processed ideas. And in that letter, I think she really did, and it made a difference. And I think that's and his answer to her was not a letter, but was the creation of Mr. Rian, our mutual friend.
And do we know how long it took from her first letter to him starting to write in Our Mutual Friend, having this great Jewish character there, who is one of the most lovely characters in Dickens as well?
He is truly lovely, is he not? It takes a couple of years. I have to go back. Is this an open book test, Lucinda?
Sorry.
I really have to go back here. So her first letter was in 1863. And can you say off the top of your head what he wrote out?
Yeah, well, then he was already working. That's great. So that's really, really good. So it was very quick, his response to her. So you say she spoke his language. She was obviously a very interesting woman.
Yes, she was. Yes, she was born in Jamaica, and she married her husband, James Davis, and I think they were distant cousins, and they married. They lived in London, and again, this was not they were not stereotypes. They were a middle-class Jewish family, and educated. She loved to read. Again, she was a big fan. I mean, it was interesting because when we discussed with the illustrator how to illustrate Eliza Davis, and that's a whole other story because
Yeah.
Anthony Stancliffe, the illustrator, did something incredible. You see this picture here?
Yes, I love it. It's a beautiful picture.
She never got to see a picture of the real Eliza Davis, and she was just inspired by what a middle class British woman, how they would have dressed, because that's how she would have dressed,
Yeah.
modestly, but also just as a middle class British woman. But what Bethany did, which was amazing, because we have had the pleasure of being contacted by Adrienne Harris, a descendant of Eliza Davis herself, and she sent us a portrait and looks just like
That's
this.
incredible. Wow.
It was incredible, like somebody was guiding her hand. I just
Yeah. How fantastic. And so you have done through this, you've been then able to go into schools to work with the Charles Dickens Museum in London. Tell us about all the work you've been doing, because sadly, we need education still, don't we? I mean, there's still an increasing numbers in the US and the UK, I know, of anti-Semitic acts. Tell us what you're doing to help counteract this and what we can all do.
Thank you so much for asking that, Lucinda. I just want to say, going back to my mother, the retired teacher,
Yeah.
um, I love going into schools, and I always feel like I'm continuing my mother's work, and how gratifying this was to her to know that Charles Dickens, someone she also admired, had a good heart and ended up becoming a champion for Jewish people, which he did, because not only did he write that character, but he spoke up, and
Yeah.
because the same way he spoke up. In all of my books, listen, I've written many books. I always want kids to leave my books, not just admiring the people in the book, but wanting to be heroes and heroines themselves. So the same way Eliza spoke up to Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens spoke up to all of England and made a difference, I want them to be inspired to go and speak up. So I created this project called Dear ... So like Dear Mr. Dickens, write down, use your words to write to somebody how they could make a positive difference, whether it's somebody in leadership or just your general community. And sometimes children have just simply created posters to say, please clean up the earth, or be kind to others, or take care of our animals, or I mean, whatever. I don't tell them what to speak up about. It's whatever moves them, whatever they feel needs changing, whatever they feel needs helping. But I will also add that a lot of praise for the Charles Dickens Museum in London, which I know you are very involved with.
I'm a patron of the museum. Yeah.
They are such a fantastic museum, and they, on their own, partnered with the Jewish Museum of London to create this incredible program, a two-part program, and the first part is free. And the two-part program teaches kids to recognize signs of prejudice and to learn how to speak up, because this is about, first of all, you have to see. You can't deal with what you can't see. Sometimes people over things. I mean, I think Charles Dickens, when he created some of those stereotypes, I don't think he was thinking of himself as being prejudiced. I think he just wasn't thinking about it. He didn't know Jewish people. He didn't have Jewish friends.
Absolutely. That was the case so much. I mean, if you think how segregated, you mentioned that word earlier, people were. And when you look at general writing, the language is so different from how we would write today, thankfully. But there's also, I think it's really important that we are aware that this happened in the past, because if we try and pretend that everybody in the past was, completely non-sexist, nobody was misogynistic, nobody was anti-Semitic, nobody was anti-anybody who wasn't like them, we're doing a real disservice to history. And we're also making people think that nothing can change. Whereas, I think we need to show what happened in the past. And what your project does so well is showing how change can be effected, and how important it is to have dialogue. I mean, you said yourself, his first letter was, these Jewish people want to buy my house. And then straight away to the same friend, oh, wow, they were really nice. I mean, that's when we see around the world with peace projects, it's all about breaking down barriers, isn't it? That when somebody meets someone from a different community, a different belief system, that actually they realize, oh, hang on a minute, all my prejudices were unfounded. Well, one hopes they might do.
And that is so wonderful. And that is one of the great gifts of spending time with other people, of being in other communities, but also of books, because Charles Dickens was able to do so much good when he created his Mr. Rhea, suddenly people who had lived with these stereotypes as he did now saw a Jewish character differently. And that changed their world and made them question their own stereotypes. So again, the books we give our children as well, the books that open doors to them that
So important. So
are,
important, yeah.
and you are an author too. You know what that means. Lucinda, when you create characters, you know that affects how people see other people.
Yeah, so tell me about the response when you read your book to children, if you go into schools. What is the response to it? Do they get the message? Do they understand? Do they start to talk about how they can make a difference?
Absolutely. And this has been the most amazing thing, because this book had a long journey, because I had a lot of people tell me along the way, as I said earlier, they said, how are kids going to get excited about letters? They certainly don't know who Eliza Davis is, and many of them don't know who Charles Dickens is. And you know what? That turned out not to be important, because I remember I've shared this all over, and I've shared it both with Jewish children and non-Jewish children, and they all get it. I remember reading this to a little boy, and I can't even tell you what, I can just tell you what, he wasn't Jewish at all. He wasn't Jewish, and I was just reading it, and what he got was that this was a story just simply about a person who was very hurt when somebody said bad things about the group she belonged to. And you could just sort of see his eyes filling up with tears for her. And he was waiting to see how Charles Dickens would respond to that letter. And then when he responded to that letter with that beautiful book with Mr. Rhea, he was so happy, and he couldn't wait to take this book home and share it with everybody he knew.
Oh, lovely.
And I will tell you something else. I have never started, this is a very unusual way of writing, because I have never started a book in the second person before.
Yes.
Start in the third person or the first person. I started this in the second person because I wanted to put children in the book right away.
Yeah.
Of someone famous you admire. What would you do if that person said or wrote something unfair? Would you speak up? Would you risk getting that person angry? Eliza Davis did. So
it's a great beginning. Really bringing them straight in.
And then, and then every teacher in every classroom, every school where I have presented this, every community center, they put out papers and markers so that kids could write letters or create posters. And if you go to my website, you will see pictures of all those posters. And the Charles Dickens Museum was kind enough to share some of the letters that they've encouraged kids to write, which has really been a beautiful thing, because again, it's not enough to it's wonderful what Eliza did, but what matters is what we do now today, what the kids do.
Yeah, and that's what when I was first told about this book, I thought the great thing was that you had this whole project about it, and that it's just continued. I'm just sharing a link to your website for those listening on the podcast. It's nancychurnin.com, and Churnin is spelled Churnin. And or you can just look on the internet and put in Dear Mr. Dickens, and I assure you it will come up, because it's become such a popular book and such a popular project. So tell us how you first got involved with the Dickens Museum, and then we'll talk a little bit about the work you've been doing with them.
In my years, as I told you, I was writing many books in between, more conventional books, I think, than this one. And so as I was working on my journey, I love going to England. My grandparents met and married in England, and two of my uncles were born there. And of course, I love, Charles Dickens and so many British novelists and poets. I love going to London. So while I was there, I went to the Charles Dickens Museum. So while this was still in manuscript form. Oh, I spent hours going through the house and just drinking everything up. And it was so wonderful. And I think it was always a dream that if I could get this book into the world, that this is what I would want to share with them. And I remember bringing home, I don't know how much I spent at the bookshop because I just brought so many things home.
That's what we like to hear. Fabulous shop at the Dickens Museum.
Oh,
You can buy Nancy's book at the Dickens Museum alongside lots of other things as well. A little bit of plug there. So when you wrote this, just to say, wrote this very personally for your mum, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
And did you actually manage to give her a copy of it, didn't you?
You know, Lucinda, that was such an emotional moment for me because I was racing the clock a little bit. As I told you, I actually started this book in 2013 and it didn't come into the world until 2021 because that's how long I worked on this. And in 2021, my mother had started to show signs of dementia. And I had wanted so much to share this with her. And I told the publisher, and they got me an early uncorrected proof so I could bring it home to her because it didn't come out until I think, oh my gosh, was it October, November that year? But they got it to me in August. And I was able to share this with her. And she cried, and we cried together because you see, all her life, she had always turned to writers, authors like Charles Dickens for comfort because as a young Jewish girl growing up in New York City, she had faced a lot of prejudice herself. And she had turned to books for comfort. And when she went and read about Fagin, she felt there was no comfort for her in this otherwise beautiful book. And it had been so painful for her. And I knew that, as I said, I knew there was more to Charles Dickens. And when I shared this book about Eliza Davis and the letter and the friendship and how he had changed and become an advocate, it healed her heart, you know, because when you become a teacher because you feel you can change and help hearts and minds grow. And when she realized Charles Dickens himself could still change and grow as an adult, it made her feel better what she had dedicated her life to as a teacher, always helping and teaching and changing, that he was still able to be taught. He could learn, he could grow, he could do better, we could all do better. And she said, she just read it over and over and said, oh, this is such an important book. This is so important. And then as the dementia started to take over her mind, she started to get confused. And she thought I was Eliza Davis. And she said, oh, did Charles Dickens respond to your letter? Did he write back to you? And I said, yes, he wrote.
That's so lovely that you were able to have that conversation and set her mind at rest.
Yes, and then she was so happy and she would read it over and over, feeling that he had written back to me. But you know what? It was true in a way, because isn't it true that we experience everything as it may have happened many years ago, just as Charles Dickens wrote his books many years ago, but as we read it, it happens to us. We are the characters in the book. And for her, this book was about a current event. It was about Charles Dickens writing back to me. And he writes back to us, he writes for us. And I hope children will feel this way. And I hope it will give them courage to speak up and to write.
And I hope that it will encourage people to read Our Mutual Friend as well and discover that Fagin is not the only Jewish character in Dickens.
And what's more, as I learned about Charles Dickens, is he started to write positive things about Jewish people in his magazine all the year round. When he played Oliver Twist, because you know he loved to perform, he'd stop the hunch, he didn't add the nose, he stopped acting so stereotypical. You know, he stopped using those stereotypes when he performed the part. So,
and he asked his printers as well, didn't he, to change. So in later editions of Oliver Twist, where he'd just written the Jew, he changed it to the old man. And they'd really tried to make a difference in Oliver Twist as well. I mean, obviously there's still a lot in there that people will dislike, but the fact that he went back and changed it, I think, is quite fascinating, because we tend to think of that as being something, oh, you just do that with digital books. You know, if you're self-published, you can go back in and change it, but otherwise the book is set in stone. But he went back and changed, thanks to Eliza Davis.
He absolutely did. And you know what, there's actually a fascinating debate going on right now, because some people ask, and I don't have the answer to this, I'm just saying that there's a debate going on, should you all go back and change even the early chapters? Because one of the reasons he changed the later chapters was because the reprinting had already started and it would have been too expensive to redo the whole thing. stopped it where it was when he had come to this realization and changed it in all of the chapters going forward.
Yes.
So there's debate now, should scholars go back and change the whole book in accordance to what he clearly wanted? I don't have the answer to that, but I'm just telling you it's a fascinating.
Yes. And it's an interesting one, because a lot of the time at the moment we're hearing about authors whose works are being edited by editors, but not something that they themselves would have changed. But when we know that Dickens himself wanted to change it at that time, that's a whole different ballgame from going back and taking out words from a writer who's long dead and doesn't have any say over it. So it's a very interesting discussion. Yeah. And so with the Dickens Museum, you've created this fabulous educational program, which is for, I think it's between 8 and 11 years old?
I think that's the target age, but I really have to give the Charles Dickens Museum all the credit there. They were inspired by my book, and they shared it with me, but this was really their own wonderful, wonderful project, and they worked on it a long time. And and again, on their own also, they reached out to the Jewish Museum of London, because they also wanted to make sure that as they developed this program, it was going to be very respectful to the Jewish community as well. And to me, that's something so very extra beautiful about all this, because this is a book about a friendship, again, between a Jewish woman and a Christian, a writer who was Christian. And now, because of that, the Charles Dickens Museum and the Jewish Museum of London have become friends. And I think it's just bringing communities together in a beautiful way. But again, I want to give the credit to the museum for this specific project, because they worked so hard. They shared it with me, and I just mainly said, wow, you're doing a great job. That was my main input, other than the book.
And then how did it feel when you knew that that Miriam Margolyes, who's also a patron of the Dickens Museum, was going to do a video? And I've put this into the chat just for those of you listening on the podcast. You can find this on YouTube on the Charles Dickens Museum's page. You can also find a link on their website, and if you put "Dear Mr. Dickens" and Miriam Margolyes, it should hopefully come up on your search engine. So what did that feel like, Nancy? Did you get the chance to look at it beforehand, or did you suddenly get it sent and think, wow, this is amazing?
Well, they sent me the video. The Charles Dickens Museum, the educators of the Charles Dickens Museum sent me the video, before it went live, and I listened to her read it, and it was like, because I'm used to reading the book, and I feel like I read it pretty well. I mean, I wrote the book, and I know how I want, and I'm listening to her read it, I'm going, wow, because she gets it, and she infuses it with such feeling. And I mean, she is such an incredible, I'm saying actress, but I'm almost wanting to, I want a bigger word than actress, because she is
performing it, isn't she? She's just really bringing it to life. And not all actors can narrate. I mean, I've found that I listen to a lot of audiobooks. They're not all good narrators. And Miriam is an excellent narrator. She really imbues things with such skill. And I watched the video, and I've put the link for those who are watching in the chat. And as I say, you can find it online. And it's just fantastic the way she brings it to life. So it must have been amazing for you seeing that done to your words.
It was, and I was so moved, because also I know that she wouldn't have done it if she didn't care for the book. And I was told that she really had liked it so much, and I have so much respect for her. And I know that she's done so much. She did this wonderful play about Dickens's women, which was amazing, and she's done so much amazing work in stage and film. Although I have to tell you, the thing I was hoping that the kids are going to connect with, of course, she's Madame Sprout in Harry.
Yes, exactly. She's in Harry Potter. That's how they all know her.
I love it, and of course she was hilarious. She was so funny. She really can do anything. But the fact that she got the book, and I have to tell you, Lucinda, you have been amazing. And I remember getting an email from you about the book, and that how much you liked it, and I just was a puddle, because it meant so much to me. I mean, you have to understand how much that I read and revered and reread Charles Dickens growing up, and that his descendant, you, a writer in your own right, would appreciate this book and feel the love and respect in it, because one thing I also want to emphasize is that this is not simply a question of somebody, these are two great people, because Eliza Davis spoke up, but Charles Dickens had to have a great heart to accept that he'd made a mistake and to do better. And that's what we can all learn from too. None of us are perfect. I would not like to be held accountable for everything I've said ever since I was born. And I've improved over time and gotten wiser and kinder, and that's always my goal. But the fact that, but some people are so brittle, they're afraid to admit a mistake, and then they cling to it twice as hard. But not Charles Dickens. He kept growing all his life. And it's an example to all of us. I mean, Eliza Davis herself said that about him. She said, that, she talked about his powerful pen, and that he had done the greatest thing that a person could do, which was atone for a wrong. And so
that's
I think
atoning for a wrong. That's such an interesting thought. We've got a very thought-provoking question that's come in. Have all your efforts made any impact? Gosh, this is a huge one, in changing the KKKs and white supremacist behavior. Well, I think that's a hard ask. But in your community, while you've been, and in the world community, while you've been educating people, do you think you have seen changes that you can actually think, wow, I've managed to do that through my schools program?
in so many ways, and this is true in this book, and this is true in my work going to schools, sometimes we see some immediate effects, but many effects we are planting seeds hoping they are going to grow later. Like one thing, I'll get back to that question, but one thing, for instance, I say in the back matter of the book, that England went from being the country of the blood libel, a country that expelled all its Jewish population in the 1400s, to becoming the country of the Kindertransport, the only country that took in the Jewish orphans during the Holocaust. Was that because of Charles Dickens? Was that because Eliza Davis wrote to Charles Dickens and Charles Dickens changed the hearts of the country? Well, you know what? I think it was a factor, and that was past their lifetime. They never got to see that.
Yeah.
So go to the schools, and some of the schools will have population of Jewish and non-Jewish children. Some of them don't have any Jewish children at all. Some of them have all Jewish populations. So am I making an impact? I hope I'm making an impact the way Charles Dickens, Eliza Davis and Charles Dickens made an impact. You put this out there, children's minds and hearts are fertile. Another one of my favorite authors is C.S. Lewis. And one of my favorite books in the Narnia series is The Magician's Nephew. Why? Remember in the birth of that new world, where a world is so new that if you dropped a little piece of metal, it becomes a lamppost?
Yes, I'd forgotten it. Yeah.
I do feel like working with children is like that. I drop a book like this, these ideas into that fertile mind. They are new worlds. They are our new worlds, into their hearts, into their minds. Who knows what that might sprout into? All of a sudden, they're going to think in a different way about how it feels when you say something hurtful about a group. They're going to think about the courage it takes to speak up. They're going to think about the nobility of spirit it takes to admit that you're wrong and to do better. And so I feel I'm dropping these into this new world the way it was dropped into the new world in The Magician's Nephew. I hope this magic takes root.
And of course, the children you're working with, it's going to be when they're adults that we're going to start to see this change, because hopefully they will have changed that attitude. So it's a long time coming, isn't it? But one can only hope that, as you say, that seed that you're planting will definitely start to grow. I know that one thing you've done is that it's been created in Braille, isn't it? Tell us about that.
Well, I am so thrilled to have a wonderful relationship with the National Braille Press, which is based here in the United States in Massachusetts. And they had discovered, I think, the first book of mine they had wanted to translate was Manshi Moves a Mountain. And it's interesting about the National Braille Press, it's such a labor intensive, I'm going to show you what it looks like. Here it is. It's such a labor intensive effort that they have to be careful with what they do. And usually they take just best-selling books, like things like The Wimpy Kid, that every kid wants to read. And why did they pick Dear Mr. Dickens? They said to me, we want our kids to have this story too.
So can you describe it for people on the podcast of what it is that makes it so different?
What they do is they take the book, they take the hardcover book, they break the binding, and they put and then they create braille pages in a kind of a hard plastic that goes over the regular pages. And the reason they do that is because very often in a family, you might have a blind parent and a seeing child. Like a dear friend of mine is blind and her child can see, my friend Jen Armbruster, and her child can see. And this way she can read by using her fingers on the, and he can see the pictures. In other families, a parent might be seeing and the child might be blind. So the child is learning to read and can feel the words, and the parent can also describe the picture to the child.
So that's wonderful. So there's a transparent braille page placed over the printed page. I've never seen that before. That's so good. And can you read braille?
I wish I could. I wish I could. It's such an amazing language, and I just have so much respect. But to master it, I have a friend who was a teacher of the blind, and she can read it, and it's wonderful. But I do bring this to the classrooms for the children to feel, and I feel this is another way of breaking down walls, because then they have an appreciation of that there are people that are different. The seeing children have an appreciation that there are children that are different from them, and that they can support each other. And some people will support the National Braille Press, and they will even purchase books to be given to children who are blind, because these are books that sometimes can be a little bit more expensive, and it's hard for the children who are blind to get all the books that they need and they want. Although they did make this a book of the month, and for children who are part of that program, they all got this book for free.
That's fantastic. And so this is something, I mean, we're talking about just this one book, but you've written a lot of books. And what I love, and on your website, people can see this as well, you create free teacher guides for all of your books, don't you? Tell us how you go about that. What kind of things do you put in? And you allow people to just download them and print them off for free. So tell us how that first came about. What was the first one that you did, and why were you inspired to do that?
Well, first of all, as you know, I am the daughter of a teacher. I would not dare put a book into a world without a teacher guide. I always put a teacher guide in, and then when they go to my website, I actually have a separate page for each book. You'll find the teacher guide, you'll find resources, because so many of my books are based on real people or based on history. So lots of resources, and there's always a project, because just as with Dear Mr. Dickens, I always want children to thin it after they close the last page to think, well, now what can I do? So the very first one I'll just show you was the William Boy story, which is the true story. I know you're not big on baseball in England, although in Canada they love baseball. But this is a true story of a deaf baseball player who was born when our president Abraham Lincoln was president, and baseball was a new game, and he wanted to play this. And they said, how can you play, William? You can't hear the umpire's calls. So he teaches the umpires his language, sign language. So again, this is say out is American Sign Language. And the kids love it. And I have learned some sign language that I always share. And the project here is to write letters to the National Baseball Hall of Fame, because guess how many deaf players are honored in the Hall of Fame?
Is it just William Hoy? Oh, he's not even on it at all. Wow.
So we've got a letter campaign going.
Definitely that is a letter to write. So how were you first inspired to do that? How did you hear about William Hoy?
Well, I was a longtime journalist, as a matter of fact. So I worked for the Los Angeles Times in San Diego. I worked for the Dallas Morning News for many years in Dallas, Texas. I still live in the North Texas area. And one day I there was a high school in Garland, Texas, doing a play by Alan Meyer and Michael Novak called The Signal Season of Dummy Hoy. And I went, what? And I never heard of it before, and I'm a very curious person. And I found out it was about this deaf baseball player, William Hoy, who I'd never heard of. I went, this is amazing. I wrote an article. I got a thank you email from a man in Columbus, Ohio, which surprised me because Columbus, Ohio is a bit far from Texas, and this is a high school play. So it seemed a little strange to me. But the writer was Steve Sandy, who is deaf, who was a friend of the Hoy family, since became a lifelong friend. I've been now friends with, I promised Steve Sandy to write this book. I am now friends with the Hoy family. You know, I just recently sent a copy to one of the new little Hoys. Yes. William Hoy's great grandson, Adam Hoy, asked me to autograph a copy for his sister's new baby. And I just sent that off in the mail. And I really, and again, I just have to say, I love that so much when I write these books to honor people as well as to inspire the kids. And so when I can become friends with the families, it's just, it makes me feel I did right by them. And so again, Lucinda, I come back to this. It just means so much to me to spend this time with you, to have the support from you, from the Dickens Museum, the Dickens Society. It's been, the fellowship has been so supportive.
And then you were contacted by Eliza Davis's family. So tell us about that relationship and how that's developing.
That was amazing. And again, I have to give credit to the Charles Dickens Museum, and one of the Charles Dickens Museum. They are so dedicated, and one of the people in the education department had devoted herself to trying to find a descendant of Eliza Davis, which honestly I had given up on. I was really trying. I even hired someone to help me, and I got nowhere. I mean, I did as much research as I could and just dead ends. And so this wonderful person at the Charles Dickens Museum, I'm going to have to, okay, and she ends up sitting at a party, and she shares with this person at the party about her search for a descendant of Eliza Davis. And guess who she shares that with? A descendant of Eliza Davis, Adrian Harris. And
it's astonishing the number of times these coincidences happen in life. And if authors put them into a novel, people say, oh, that's ridiculous, but they happen all the time. And one thing, when I was looking at your website, one thing that struck me was your book on Anne Frank and Martin Luther King Jr., that they were born a year in the same year, which I had never actually realized before. So tell us about when you started writing this and the message behind your work with this book and the work you do in schools with this book.
I want to thank you so much for asking about this, Lucinda. This is such a special book to me also, and I'm going to answer that question. But I have to tell you, just yesterday, I got an email. The California Reading Association has picked this as one of their books of the year and has asked me to fly out to California to be presenting and signing this. This just happened yesterday. And this book has also been honored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. They selected it for their Hamilton Reads program. An actor in the Hamilton musical on Broadway, Daniel Yearwood, there is a video of him reading this aloud and discussing.
So this book is it's called Martin and Anne, and yeah. It just looks absolutely beautiful. Tell us what the main message of this is.
Okay, this is the main message of this. I wrote this came out in 2019, which was, they were both born in 1929. They would have been 90 years old that year. And what struck me is, it takes a couple of years for something to be published. I wrote it in 2017 at a time when I saw a rise in racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, so much ugliness in America. We
have the same over here. The change has been horrifying in the last few years. So we really do feel heartfelt as well that it's definitely something that's sadly global.
And I was feeling so discouraged, Lucinda, because I was also under this illusion we'd made so much progress. I didn't think we were going to slip back into these ugly, this hatred and persecution and prejudice. And I saw it come back, and I was so discouraged. And when I get discouraged, when I'm sort of feeling really sad and down, I look for the people who bring us light. And I thought of Dr. King, who, all he faced. And I thought of Anne Frank and all she faced, and how they still gave us words of hope and possibly, and they never gave up, even in the face of all the terrible things that happened during their time. And then as I was studying them both and studying their beautiful words, I realized they were both born in the same year, 1929. And I think at the time I hadn't realized that before. And then I started thinking, well, what was happening in 1929? Well, it was the stock market crash, the year of the Great Depression. Times were very hard. And then I thought of this correlation. Very often when times are bad, people should work together to make things better. But too often there are people who divide us and have us attack somebody else, another group. So in Europe, Jewish people were in the minority. In America, people of color were in the minority. And there was and then as I studied their lives, I saw so many parallels, how they were both, 5, and they were both born to loving families. When they were 5, they couldn't go to their neighborhood schools. They weren't welcome. They grew up seeing ugly signs saying they aren't welcome. And by the way, I have to shout out to the brilliant illustrator Yevgenia Neighbor, by the way, a native of Ukraine, who now lives in New York City.
Right.
And her brilliant illustrations, they live in different worlds, but they almost look like they're looking at each other, don't they?
And that's so poignant to have a Ukrainian illustrator as well, given what's happening in the world right now.
Like,
Yeah.
and turn to words. So this is a common theme for me. In a way, it almost sets this up, how they turn to words to express their vision of a better world. And that's hard to talk to kids. Well, what are words? Words, we can't see them. You can't touch them. You can't eat them. I mean, you can see them. You can't touch them. You can't eat them. You can't wear them. What can words do? And we talk about how words can give us courage and strength. We use words in our signs that we make. We use words in the laws that we write. And this is, again, the brilliance of Yevgenia Neighbor. If you see even I can't hide the terrible things that happen. But if you look at her illustrations, and I realize on the podcast, you won't see this, but maybe people will look up the pictures.
Yeah, they are very beautiful. And there's a great deal of color in things as well. So it stops it being oppressive, because you're dealing with difficult subjects, but the illustrator has created it in such a way that it really does draw your eye in. Now, we're talking here about educating children, but sadly what we're realizing now is, in both our countries and in many countries around the world, that it's the adults who need the education most of all. What would be your tips of what can we do, those of us kind of here today and those listening later on, what can we do to tackle anti-Semitism? I know from friends of mine, it's just getting worse and worse in the UK all the time. What can we do as individuals and as communities to try and change what's happening, and that's happening for the worst at the moment?
Yeah, I so appreciate your question, because just wanting to make that change is the first step. And I really think, when I go back and I think about where the problem started, how somebody even as good-hearted as Charles Dickens could have created these ugly stereotypes, it came about because of segregation.
Yeah.
And even if segregation isn't a law, segregation can happen because of economic conditions, because of societal pressures. People can also self-segregate. There can be all sorts of ways of keeping people apart in their own separate bubbles, going to different schools. I think it would be so wonderful to make an effort just to come together, to do events together. For instance, you asked about Martin and Anne. Martin and Anne has been used. I've seen people in predominantly Black churches meet with communities in Jewish community centers and synagogues to get together and to share the book, because everybody is represented in this book. And books can be, and I've done this in community programs where there are adults and children. There can be family nights where you share a book. Dear Mr. Dickens, again, bringing communities together. I mean, Charles Dickens, Eliza Davis, two different religions. And yet, oh, by the way, this is one of my favorite pictures that Bethany Stanfield created. We spend a lot of time talking about this. See this final page here?
You want to describe it for those on the podcast?
I'm going to describe it. So in this final page, we have Charles Dickens in his study holding a Bible that that Eliza Davis had given him, because the Christian Jewish faiths both do share the same Bible, and she inscribed it for him. And then on the opposite page is Eliza Davis in her study, which was actually the old home of Charles Dickens.
Yeah.
And see, these are different homes. Hers has blue wallpaper, his is beige paint, and but yet at the same time they're connected. And what connects them on the binding, on the place and the little river between the pages, are the letters, and it's how words can connect us.
Yeah.
So words can connect us, and you see that in Martin and Anne as well. The words connecting us. And words can connect us. We can share books. By the way, the project for this one is Kindred Spirits. And I've had schools Zoom or visit with other schools because, our virtual abilities allow us to do that. Why not take a book like this and have different communities spend time together? And you can do the same, Dear Mr. Dickens, through the program with the museum. Why not have different communities, Jewish and non-Jewish communities, meet together and share the book? It can be enjoyed by adults as well as children.
Definitely.
Or meet together, all ages. My books are designed for all ages. I have even presented them at senior centers, and the seniors love them, just as my mother does.
You say you've presented them at schools, at senior centers, at a Dickens conference. Yeah, as you say, all ages. So just a final question. How do you think we can all inspire children to be heroes and heroines like the ones that you write about?
Let them know that they have this power. That, I always like to say to them, there's a line here about Eliza. Eliza wasn't famous or powerful, but she had the same three things that Charles Dickens had: a pen, paper, and something to say. She sat down and wrote a letter. Children and all ages, you have that power. You have a pen, you have a paper, you have something to say, whether you write it with a pen and paper, whether you write it with markers, whether you write it with crayons, whether you write it on your computer or your smart pad or whatever, your iPad, whatever you do. You can speak up. Your voice matters. We need all the voices. And if I can make another little reference to another wonderful book, Dr. Seuss, Horton Hears a Who. Remember when that whole Whoville was in danger? They're living on this tiny little flower. No one believes they're even alive except Horton, because he can hear them and no one else can hear them. And he says, you've got to all yell. And they're all yelling as loud as they can, except there's this one little shirker named Jojo, and he's like this with his yo-yo, and he's not yelling. Well, you know what? It's not until they find Jojo and he adds his voice to everybody else's voice that it breaks through and people hear. Well, children, your voice might be the voice we're waiting for. Your voice may be the voice that breaks through, and along with the rest of all the other children, with all of us, that breaks through so that people hear. We need every voice. We need your voice. That's
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's been an absolute pleasure getting lots of fantastic messages, all saying heartening and inspiring, and how much they love it. One says, oh my goodness, I'm totally inspired. Where's my paper and pen? Will Word do? Absolutely, it will. Thank you so much, Nancy Churnin. It has been a real pleasure to have you here on Goldster with us today, and good luck with all your future projects. And for anybody who's looking for Nancy's books, it's nancychurnin.com, and you can also, of course, buy them on Bookshop. And here's a radical thing: go into your local bookshop and buy them there, and if they don't have them, they will order them in. Thank you all so much for coming along, for your wonderful messages, and I will see you all on Thursday for the book club. So join me then Thursday and Friday. I'm interviewing Anna Cale on Thursday about her new book on Diana Dawes. And on Friday, I'm interviewing vet Sean Wensley about his book Through a Vet's Eyes, what we can all do to make life better for animals. We've got a diverse week for you here on Goldster. Take care, everybody, and I will see you soon. Thank you so much, Nancy. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lucinda. Thank you for all you do.